Well, this is a presentation about my interest in graveyards and cemeteries and covers perhaps the last 20 years from the first interesting yards that I'd come across and coincided with having the first digital camera, a Canon 10D. A little bit of background before we get started. Remembering the dead's important. And the way that we remember the dead has changed a little bit through time. The rich and influential always aim to be buried within the church building, and you've come across, no doubt, the big memorial slabs, the grave markers inside a number of the quite old churches around here in Herefordshire. The idea there was that the rich and influential wanted to be in prime position for Judgment Day, so that on Judgment Day, when they got the call, they would rise and ascend to heaven, already being in the right place, in the right orientation, etc., etc. Well, difficult to bury that many people actually within the church, and a number of these memorial slabs would get lifted, and the next in line would be interred. But you're interring corpses actually into the church, and unsurprisingly, when you've got the decomposition of the flesh, you get something of a smell. So hence the term the stinking rich. Now, for those of us not from that sort of class of society, it was generally burial in graveyards. And important, I think, to recognise that in Britain, the population increased by 60% between 1800 and the start of Victoria's reign in 1841. And unsurprisingly then, difficult to find sufficient capacity in graveyards, because as the population increases, you get a representative number then dying. So graveyards are struggling for capacity, but particularly as an awful lot of people are moving to towns and cities, greater urbanisation, such that the pressure there in towns is so much more that they haven't got space to bury people. And that's when the garden cemetery movement came about as a business sort of thing that Victorians were very adept at, seeing a business opportunity, and a number of cemeteries were set up around big centres, a number of them around London, and we'll come back to that a little later. A statistic here, cremation has only been legal in this country since 1884, or more to the point, prior to 1884 everybody was buried in the ground, and there was an interesting legal case in 1884 where it was deemed that it was not illegal to cremate someone, so long as it was done in a particular way, such that then we've got the first cemetery, purpose-built crematorium in Woking, and that opened on the 26th of March 1885. So that's a big change, albeit if one could go back all the way to Roman times, almost 2,000 years ago, cremation was quite a common way of dealing with the dead. So in terms of this presentation, which if you get too bored you can always go and do something else, social documentary photography is what I would call it. This is part one. This is about cemeteries and graveyards in Great Britain. There is another wide set of images that cover the rest of the world. Well, here is the first graveyard picture that I took, And what drew me to this was you've got the work that the sculptor has done with these flowing robes, headdress, and the like. But it's all changed through time. The weathering of this particular stone, you've got flaking here and there. The face isn't as the sculptor would have wanted it to be in the first place. So things change through time. So shape and texture, it's that sort of thing that interests me. So this is a little bit of close detail. If we step back, we can see that it's part of a much bigger memorial. And here we are, a big slab with Latin script on it, which is what you might expect. You're paying, the person that ordered this particular monument was paying a lot of money for it. So he wanted something that was going to last, that was going to be a lasting memorial to his forebear and to the family. With the English language changing as it does, you can't guarantee that if that had been chiselled out in English of the time, we would have still been able to understand and know the full meaning of this particular stone, which is why this is done in Latin, because of course it's a language that doesn't die out. And that was the rationale for this. So all we need to do is to use our everyday Latin and we can read this. Standing back further still, you get some idea of just how impressive this monument is. As with a number of monuments that we'll see a little later on, they can be very difficult to photograph. There's another stone there right in the way, so trying to get square onto it is nigh on impossible, and that's part of the interesting challenge. Now this is my first set of pictures. I think these go back to 2004, and it was a day out, and a day out where my intention was to take this particular picture. And I'm sure many people will recognise this as Greyfriars Bobby, and the pictures that you've just seen were taken in Greyfriars Yard. This little chap, lots of pictures are taken of him, but the yard next door is a quiet place for reflection. You get a few people walking through, not really that many, though to my mind it's absolutely a fascinating place to read about the history of the important people here in Edinburgh. As a yard, it's got some quite ancient memorials. Uh, this clearly is a more modern piece, but it is commemorating somebody who died in 1582, George Buchanan. And Old Town here in Edinburgh, the yard itself is surrounded by buildings, a little bit hidden perhaps, but provides a little bit of the green lungs that you want in that sort of environment. And not just monuments to the individual, but monuments to particular causes, and there are a whole section of Covenanters' graves. And here is a recognition of the beheading of the Marquis of Argyll, um, and it mentions murder and destroying and the like. So big monument, an important part of history. The little bit of the tablet at the bottom there, you can see that it's eroded away, the stone started to flake off. So these things aren't going to last forever. Interesting to go and read about parts of history that perhaps are not known in an everyday sense. Got to get your eye in a little bit in terms of being able to read them. Halt, passenger, take heed of what you see, and on you go. You might be surprised that I'm not the only person that finds graveyards interesting. And this is a piece from September of 2020 about tourism bringing cemeteries back to life. And they go on to say that I think it's Bristol's Arnos Vale makes more money from being a wedding venue than it does in terms of being a big cemetery. And the Heritage Lottery Fund has been important for a number of these sites because they really did fall into disrepair, were overgrown, vegetation everywhere. We'll come back and have a look at that a little later. So what of going into graveyards and cemeteries and reading about people? But there's more to it than reading about people. Interesting pictograms. Here we've got a clanging bell, a hourglass, somebody that's been out and about with a spade, a skull and crossbones. Is that a pirate? Quite what's going on? Well, these pictograms have meaning. The bell, well, it's the death knell. This is saying that someone's passed, someone's died. The hourglass generally recognizes a limit of time. Basically, our lifetime has passed. Tools on the right hand side there, sexton's tools, the spade you see quite a lot, but you can get tools of people who'd practiced other trades. But the skull and crossbones, very common features, the crossbones being the long bones from the legs. And this is very much that when you die and you're buried, your flesh decomposes and disappears, and what you're left with is the skeleton, in particular recognizable things like the skull and the long bones. So here we have something that is recognizing that sort of permanence. That's what we're all going to end up like, skeletons. Now, other trades I mentioned, this is George Hale, and he was a smith and farrier, and this is in Datchet in Berkshire. And in the churchyard, this particular gravestone stands looking out of the yard itself. There's a road that runs right alongside, and it's a busy part of the world, and there's a roundabout just away from the church. So an awful lot of commuters in particular sit there in their cars waiting their turn to get onto the roundabout, and this stone stands there, and you can see representation of Smith and Farrier here in a little bit more detail. There's the anvil and the other tools of his trade. So I suspect that thousands of people pass this particular stone, but I doubt whether any of them pay it any particular notice or attention. Now, skulls and crossed long bones, or at least long bones. We're now up into the northeast of Scotland, and there are a number of quite ancient yards there, and the skull and crossbones is quite a common motif. The one on the right hand side there, perhaps the ground level is changing a little bit and seems to be disappearing somewhat. This one, you've got the hourglass again, a skull. The long bone is the wrong way up. The ball of the ball joint of the hip joint is making it look a little bit like an exclamation mark, but that's what it's supposed to be. It's a long bone, or at least I think it is. On others of these large sort of table type graves, um, not relying just on the pictograms, you've got some words. Here we are. Mortality, being overtaken by vegetation, by the lichens and mosses. And on this one, this person died. Um, the sculptor has carved in the word, but the infilling here with the moss picks it out somewhat. The long bones the right way up, perhaps, um, an interesting representation of a skull, and the tooth sockets, um, yeah, quite an interesting device. And in places you get all sorts of things. So again, another of these tabletop graves, skull, long bones, hourglass. Very difficult to photograph without a drone, um, but these were some of my early attempts, and I was sort of fascinated by carvings of skulls and the like. The eyes have it, perhaps quite deep eye sockets. Maybe the eyes are too close together. Um, where the nose would have been, and then again this sort of indentation, the interesting representation for sets of teeth. A little more unusual. This is a full cadaver carving on one of these tombstones, and this again harkens back to, well, how are we all going to end up? Well, we're going to end up looking like that. The flesh is going to disappear, and that's what we're going to be like. We're going to be full skeletons. Words on gravestones can tell you a lot or a little. So here we've got the remains of Anna Oakley. Now, she mildly resigned this life. Not quite sure what that means. She was ready to go, pleased to go, or what? She lived to the age of 75, but mildly resigned this life. Pictograms again, and here we've got top of a gravestone with an angel on it. The WC, I think, represents the initials of the person, but couldn't be sure. Uh, the hand signifies something, and so do the flowers. But it isn't until you spend more time going round different graveyards and reading up on it that perhaps you find out what a lot of these motifs mean. We'll have a session on that towards the end of this talk. Memento Mori, remember me. And here we've got a yeoman farmer with a very fine horse and cart. Um, what a sort of thing to put onto a gravestone. In modern churchyards, you see people having pictures of cars and all sorts of things that were important to them, that represented their status. Now, some of the bigger memorials, it's the equivalent really of paying out for a very flash car these days, something like a top of the range Ferrari. You're spending a lot of money on some of these memorials. Here, and this is in the Greyfriars Yard, actually in Perth, again in Scotland. A couple more cadavers, but I think these must be infants. Um, they're quite startling things. In the middle there again, the crossed long bones, a very degraded skull, and then on its side, time's run out, it's the hourglass motif again. So here we are back to the mid 1700s. Same yard, but a different sort of memorial. This is a horizontal stone on the ground where it was placed. and it says, "Here lies in hopes of resurrection Mary someone or other." You can't read the rest of it. But it's now so overgrown by the roots of that tree, on Judgment Day, when she's up and off, she's going to have difficulty getting out of there. Another motif, the number 4 with the M underneath it. Usually the 4 is reversed to that, but it typically means a merchant. And unsurprising, because the merchants of towns and cities were the wealthy people. They were the ones that could afford these finely carved stones. Elsewhere in the yard, we had the example of the initials WC, and here we've got T and S. But this particular graveyard, it suggested that it's a good wildlife habitat as well. So we'll just let all the vegetation grow up and over the stones. Well, okay, makes it difficult though to see the stones, but from a photographic perspective, I've tried to do something a little different with this. This one's much easier to see because someone goes around regularly with a strimmer. I'm pleased though that they do it quite delicately, because here he is rising out of the ground with his Bible. But interesting, you see the clothes of the time, so it represents a particular sort of era. I'm afraid that the angel above has seen better times, but you can still just about make out what it is. Here, another very impressive monument. This time we're in Dumfries, and the thing that you find out going to such places and looking at these monuments, you've got a bit more information about the people, but also industry and what occurred in the local area. So this is Captain Swanson's memorial, and Henry, their second son, died in the island of Jamaica. Um, Dumfries is a small town these days. At one time it was much more prosperous. The local building planners, I think, have done a good job here, that the new buildings surrounding the yard at least have got some architectural resemblance with these big memorials. I quite like the use of similar sorts of colours, the shapes of roofs, and people then that are going to be living in these buildings hopefully appreciate that they've got very quiet neighbours. In that same yard, um, this caught my eye, commemorating the upright conduct, benevolence of disposition, and self-acquired knowledge of James Cruikshanks. He did all of that. He was only 34 years old when he died, and his fellow labourers paid for this memorial. Now, top right there, as you can see, certain amount of graffiti, and I had to think that maybe that's the sort of thing that the fellow labourers might have actually appreciated. I can see it's the sort of thing that they might have done themselves. Now, a churchyard that has no church these days. It's got a mausoleum. We'll see some pictures of that, but it's an entirely Grade 2 listed churchyard. Um, the nearest point at which you can get to by car is about a quarter of a mile away. So you walk along a fairly small and insignificant track, and then eventually find yourself in this churchyard. So here we've got an angel right in front of us, but there she is in the background, a very impressive woman. There's no inscription on this stone at all to tell you anything about her. I think, though, from the way that the sculptor has approached this, she must have been a very formidable woman. And again, interesting dress, and sort of harks back to a particular time in society. Other stones in that churchyard are perhaps not weathering quite as well. You can see here a rather grand um, piece of carving with these capitals and columns. Um, you can just about make out what appears to be a head, but otherwise the moss has grown on it, and though that might not be such a bad thing, where the moss grows, it enables the water to collect a little bit more, and that adds to the porosity of the stone. The water gets sucked into the surface layers of the stone, and the next time there's a frost, a little bit more disappears. So that's starting to show considerable signs of weathering. And this pair here, you can just about make out an angel on the left hand side, and you can certainly make out a skull on the right hand side. A couple in dress of the period, again being overtaken a little bit by moss, and you're starting to lose the crispness, the detail of the carving. And an awful lot of the detail of the carving has disappeared from this one. Is it ET? Is it an angel? Can you just about make out some wings in the background? Bit difficult to tell. So now really it's a head with different coloured lichen on it, and it's a study of colour and texture. The mausoleum on this site, a rather grand affair, and gives an impression of how wealthy the local landowners were. So inside this churchyard, this mausoleum is again fenced off from the rest of the yard. Now, elsewhere along the Dumfries and Galloway coastline, there are hillside graveyards with very little left in terms of buildings nearby, and certainly an awful lot of the little towns have long since disappeared. But here we are, just inside a quite overgrown little churchyard, and again this stone here on the right, Richard, his son, who died in the island of Jamaica in 1828, aged 23 years, and an awful lot of the supporting managers, I suspect, and the organisers in terms of the slave trade, and bringing back rum into this part of the world. A little bit more of an impression of just how overgrown some of these churchyards are. Here I managed to get in through the wall. There's a way over, and bracken growing up to the full height of quite a lot of these memorials. Um, it's a shame perhaps that people aren't visiting and getting the opportunity to understand more of the people who lived and died in this area. But on the stones, they tell you a little bit about who's buried there. So here's James Beattie. He was a teacher of English in Dumfries. Um, Overgrown, been there since the early 1800s. Now this is a particular stone that confused me, and I thought, well, to grive. I wonder what grive is. Is that an old English alternative expression for to grieve? And I don't think it is. I think it's just straightforwardly that the mason in chiseling this out forgot the E. Now, who would have thought that that sort of thing could have happened? Further down, as you can see, missing out E's and just replacing them with an exclamation with a comma is fairly straightforward. God called me, uh, but grive rather than grieve. Mistakes happen. He wasn't the only mason, perhaps, to make a mistake. Here, another mason in chasing out the words that the person wanted, um, forgot the O in stone. Well, easily fixed. Just put it above the line. These things happen. Spelling can be a little hit and miss, but interesting here and there where they've had to go to the trouble of putting extra letters in. And you certainly find that on some of the big stones, the lettering gets rather small towards the right hand side as they've suddenly realised that they're running out of room to get all of the words on. Now, in terms of impressive locations, this is the necropolis in Glasgow. And standing back like this, you get some idea of the scale, the number of graves that are there, and a little bit about the organised, picturesque landscape. It's on a terraced area. It's got walks all the way through it. The idea being that not only did you bury people there, but you would go and walk around these areas and see who else was there, get some idea of how much the other important families had spent on their memorials. Say quite elaborate, certainly very expensive memorials for some people. On the right hand side, an entire cluster of Celtic crosses, very popular. We've got a column, in fact, a couple of columns sticking up. In the distance on the left hand side, urns on the top of large pieces of stone. Similar sorts of monuments, almost from a catalogue. In fact, I would imagine that quite a few of these were from stonemasons' catalogues. More impressive, perhaps, are some of the big figured monuments. Here we've got Charles Tennant. Looking at on a rather grey sort of day, I thought black and white might fit this rather better than a muted set of colours. And I quite liked the woman in a slightly different stone, which means that she shows up more as a white figure compared to the greys that we've got here. And then in terms of photographic technique, contre jour against the light, uh, an opportunity to be on the edge of the necropolis here, looking back out over the city, harking perhaps a little bit to the industrialization of the area, the wealth, all of these buildings, lots of people live in that area. And here we are, we've got one of the important, a silhouette of one of the important people of the past. Extensive population of the area now, but also perhaps of the graveyard, the cemetery itself. Um, they're almost jammed in, cheek by jowl in parts. Um, we've got an urn with cloth over it, a headless figure on the left hand side. The big mausoleum right on the left represents the arts, and there are a number of tablets there to famous people from arts and drama. A large bust there in the middle the lady here on the right hand side, whole mixture of designs, materials, and styles. And here, um, again, it's got a little bit of graffiti on it, but I don't think you can quite read it. Somebody has scratched into it "Drunken Angels," and that's not what they are. Yes, they're angels, but they're your weeping angels, and they're weeping there for Esther, the eldest daughter of Henry Cooper, a different Henry Cooper, and quite splendid things to look at. They've weathered. The colours have changed, um, but you've then got comments that people going round now put on them sort of what other people see in some of these memorials. And from one quite large cemetery, this is Arnos Vale. And in Bristol, there are quite a few very colourful streets. And Arnos Vale has a large cemetery, purpose designed and laid out again on a little bit of a horseshoe sort of terraced sloping area. It's got its main entrance that we will see in a while, and this is at the top of the site, and is the secondary entrance back into what is now a little bit of a housing estate. And you can see it had been in some disrepair. You can see that from the roof. A building that had been vandalised, hence all of the blocked up windows. So now it's just been given a little bit of a colourful makeover to fit in with the rest of the graveyard, or or maybe not. But I first visited Arnos Vale in 2009, and quite a lot of it was still overgrown. Um, it had fallen into neglect and disrepair over many years. So there would have been, I suppose, 30 or 40 years of growth of vegetation. And here you can see ivy all over these fine stone monuments, the brambles there, rhododendron, all sorts of trees growing up in between. And some of these monuments are 15, 20 feet tall, and yet they're still, for the most part, hidden from view because they've got all of this vegetation over them. When walking along some of the cleared areas and just peering into the undergrowth, you see quite a few faces staring back out at you. Now that's fine during the day. Quite what that would be like in the twilight hours, I'm not sure. But given that I don't do that sort of photography, I've never mastered artificial lighting and flash guns to such a degree. All of my stuff's taken during daylight hours. And coming back to um, some of these monuments, you think, well, the Vandals have been in there. Just look at this poor column. It's been chipped off, and that's where all of the bits have ended up. The ivy there just trying to bind it all together. And again, a little bit like the necropolis in Glasgow, a lot of graves and gravestones. And you can see here that the trees there in the background, all of that area has just been left at this point. I suspect that 10 or more years on, a lot more of it has been cleared. But at the time, it was difficult to see quite a few of these quite large and elaborate memorials. Um, Gives a feeling of enclosure a little bit more perhaps than was ever intended. And this, the anchor is a device that's used quite a bit. And here we are, Arnos Vale, Bristol, important port, grave of a sailor, perhaps. Uh, but the chain there, all of that's in stone. That's not a metal chain. It's impressive what the sculptor has managed to achieve. And staring forlornly into space, looking for some daylight, perhaps. Again, another impressive memorial that uh, is surrounded or was surrounded by trees, so you just get the dappled light onto the stone. Now, Arnos Vale was in quite some disrepair, and a big task to try to do anything about it. Like a number of these sites, it was privately owned, and the company that owned it basically had run out of money for any sort of maintenance, and things were just left to for the vegetation to grow over, and that was about it. But the Heritage Lottery Fund has been a godsend for a number of these places, providing grants for them to be able to clear back the vegetation, make safe quite a few of these big memorials, and moving these on from being privately owned, profit-making or loss-making businesses into charitable trusts. So Arnos Vale is run by a charitable trust these days, and as it says, they rely on public donations and are rather proud of their angels. They've got a lot of angels around the cemetery. My attempt on the right-hand side there, infrared works well, I think, with a heavily vegetated area, because otherwise you've got green, just shades of green everywhere. In infrared, that comes out with this startling white, almost looks as though it's taken in the middle of the winter. Doesn't do that much with the stone, so you get a different sort of contrast between the vegetation and the stone. And back to the main entrance buildings of Arnos Vale, and this is where they conduct the weddings. They've also got a little conference room there, have all sorts of meetings, and the charitable trust is able to get some income from those sorts of activities. Again, this is a few years old, so I suspect that quite a lot of this undergrowth has been removed, but it gave it a particular sort of feel at the time, with all of the stone being engulfed, encased, with different sorts of vegetation, made things look a little bit different. Now, another cemetery, and this is Brookwood. This is a somewhat different scale, as an awful lot of the churchyards in London were filled to capacity, and London was such a growing city, it needed room for people to be buried. And another of these companies was set up, the Brookwood Cemetery Company. The cemetery is just outside of Woking and was served from London. It had a dedicated railway line with a terminus at Waterloo, adjacent to the main platforms at Waterloo. So a dedicated railway line that brought funeral parties, the coffins and the funeral parties, out here to Brookwood. And at Brookwood there are two platforms. There's one for the Anglicans and another for the others. But in terms of a business, it worked very well, because you could organise for the coffin to travel on the train, together with all of the mourners and all of the attendants. So they'd all get on the train at Waterloo, come out here to Brookwood, be taken off the train into the cemetery, and the interment would take place, and then the whole party could go back to one of the platform buildings and have the wake there, and then the mourners transported back to London on the train. So a very good use of resources to make that happen. Brookwood is big. It extends to about 500 acres. It's the largest cemetery in certainly in Europe. And when laid out, it was very much laid out as a garden cemetery. So here we've got two avenues of Wellingtonii, and you get some idea of just how impressive these redwoods can be when they're reaching adolescence or into almost into maturity. So huge trees planted when the cemetery was laid out, and planted with a lot of different sorts of trees, because again the idea was that this was going to be a resource that people would go and use to walk around, in addition to being burial plots. Trees themselves, as I said, are absolutely enormous, um, dwarf a number of the impressive mausolea, and that's what we've got here. One almost thinks, well, wasn't it a bit silly to try and put graves quite as close to these trees? Well, of course, I think perhaps not enough thought was given to just how big the trees would become and how extensive the root systems would be, because the graves were there, and then the vegetation has grown up in between. In addition to the stone memorials, some very impressive bronzes. Here we've got the wife who's died. That's her husband who's weeping over her, and he's in need of consolation, and he's being consoled by this angel. Um, Huge, great wingspan of the angel, feet off the ground. She's there to do two things. She's there to provide consolation, and then also to lead the soul of the departed off to heaven. Um, this is a big monument. That's what, 20 feet tall, something like that. So you have to stand back some way to get it all in. But it's not the only one. Again, another huge bronze of a particular stylishly carved angel. She's got a flower in her hand there. Not all of the women in the cemetery are angels. Um, this poor lady has been lamenting over, I think, her lost husband for over 100 years. She's been there in residence at the end of his grave. And a particularly interesting monument. This is to Henry Freshfield. He was only 13 when he died, and as it says, he was the only son of the mountaineer Douglas Freshfield. Uh, Douglas Freshfield, famous mountaineer, but he was also from a very important legal family, and Freshfield still exists in London. It's a corporate lawyers of quite some repute. So this memorial was designed, as it says, by Edward Onslow Ford, Royal Academician. So a very fine piece of work. You've got the bust of Henry there, and then the two puttee. Notice they've got flames that are pointing down. Their torches are pointing down. Basically, that's life being extinguished. And then just a little bit of detail of the feet of one of these puttee, and the the torch there. Um, when this was new, it would have been sparkling and white. It's had quite a lot of undergrowth around it, and that's only recently been cleared. So the lichen and the other sort of mosses ingrained in parts, but not necessarily in others. And it gives it a different sort of feel. It's not the crisp whiteness that it would have been. It's aged, but it's aged well. And then right at the bottom is this plaque, which is difficult to read, um, even when you use Photoshop or whatever just to enhance the contrast. It's difficult to read. So I've typed it all out, and you can read it for yourself. I'll give you a minute. As you can see, he was only ill for 3 days, and the family were somewhat distraught, I'm sure. Another impressive monument, and again, I think this one's grade 2 listed. William de Morgan was very much a colleague of William Morris, and De Morgan famous for tiles that he produced, particular sorts of geometric patterns. But this monument was designed by his wife, Mary Evelyn. She was an important English painter in her own right, but perhaps more important than that, she came from a very wealthy family. William de Morgan had business difficulties through most of his working life, and it was her money that kept them in the style to which they wanted to become accustomed. So, in terms of the memorial here, um, I wonder whether that's her on the left-hand side. Again, we've got that same motif, the torch being held down there, life being extinguished. On the right-hand side, we've got an angel. You can see the tops of the two wings and the halo. And then in addition, her feet aren't quite touching the ground. So again, grade 2 listed, fine piece of work. Um, and the lighting's very good, and like going into art galleries and the like, you can go anytime and see this, and it changes, looks slightly different depending upon the way the light's falling on it. And of course, everybody will recognise yet another grade 2 listed memorial, and this is in a similar part of the cemetery there. You can get some idea that with the books that are lying around, this is a man of letters, um, a rather smart bow tie, and had you have known that it was Henry von Lorne, you of course would have immediately recognised him as a very important Victorian figure. He was writer, translator, teacher of French, did important translations of a lot of French literature. And so here we have this interesting sort of ochre coloured uh, memorial. You can just see that it's signed just below the claw that's right in the middle of the screen there. But the whole monument is leaning, and that's just as the ground continues to change, as the roots of these trees move under here and there and remove moisture and the like. But an impressive monument. And talking about trees and them moving about and doing all sorts of things, Here's a gravestone put up to commemorate whoever it is that's buried there, Henry someone or other. And a couple of trees have decided that, well, that's a good place to take root. And the sheer scale of things after 100 years, it's surprising just how big and how quickly some of these trees grow. Elsewhere, and I said Brookwood extends to about 500 acres. There are areas that have been well cleared and are well looked after these days, and there are people there going around with mowers keeping the grass well clipped. And then there are the wider reaches of the cemetery. Here we've got all of this bracken. We've got Jesus on the cross um, amongst a sea of bracken. And then when you look in the background, you can see that, well, he's not alone. There are yet more uh, gravestones that you can just see the tops of. And gravestones of different sorts of designs. An impressive cross. Again, we've got all of this bracken, and you can see the silver birch and the other sort of scrubby vegetation that has grown up here. And then off there into the distance, yet another cross. And when you just stand there and you look around, the more that you look, the more that you can see these little bits of stone sticking up out of the vegetation. I found these particularly interesting. These are graves of nuns, and it seems to be that the markers for the Roman Catholics have these little hats on. And here we've got Winifred Mary, and another nun there to the left, and another row of them a little further over. But these are quite short stones, and with these very big trees shedding their needles above them, you get the feeling that very much they're starting to be buried. They're being pulled downwards, whereas they might have wanted their ultimate destination to be upwards. But this is a whole area set aside for the nuns of a particular order. You can just about make out that the line of trees in the background there, a little bit like a hedge. They separate this area from the next area over, which take the people from a different parish, a different sort of church. And then walking around the cemetery, just looking at styles and designs. Are we in the Art Deco here, 1930s? Interesting shapes and patterns, and again a very sort of Art Deco look to this with the stylized flame and interesting to my mind in terms of shapes and textures, and set off by the sheer uh, scale and contrasting colours of things like the trunk of the Wellingtonii there in the background. Now, I mentioned that going around these graveyards and cemeteries, there were certain motifs that you come across, and unsurprisingly, reading up about these, you start then to understand what it is that you're seeing. So I've just put together a number of the more important ones, so that when you go around looking at graveyards yourself, you'll know what it is that you're looking at. So here we've got a pelican. And as it says, early observers thought that they saw the parent feeding the young from a self-inflicted gash in its flesh. In reality, this is sort of regurgitation from the pouch and food that's already been consumed by the parent. But it then gives it this meaning that the pelican represents self-sacrifice, the greatest love of a parent for its children. Uh, The parent starving itself, the parent killing itself, the parent needing to provide food and nourishment for its sharp-beaked children. So we've got three of them there. The heart, the Sacred Heart or love of God, and that appears in various forms in different sorts of churchyard settings. But this one's got the skull and the long bones there underneath. So that's an interesting one. And the anchor. As I said, now this could be a seafarer, could be a sailor, but it has another meaning. It's a symbol of hope and steadfastness to the Christian faith. And this one, as it says, is erected by Alexander Adamson in loving memory of his wife. So I think that's more to celebrate hope and steadfastness, though she might have been a sailor. Um, this is a little unknown. Hands together, even more commonly seen on gravestones of all sorts of ages. So it's symbol of matrimony, and generally you find that you've got one that's feminine and the other one that's masculine, and you can tell the difference here with the lace on the left hand side and the more restrained cuffs of the man on the right hand side. Apparently, if it's gender neutral, it can represent a heavenly welcome or an earthly farewell. But I've never come across one of those, or at least I don't think I've seen one yet. Stylized, same way. This is a Welsh one, so you've got the feminine side on the left and the masculine side on the right again, but some very fine, long, tapering fingers. And talking of fingers or hands, hand pointing up, the soul has risen to heaven. And I find it interesting that if the first two fingers are together, so the first two fingers are pointing upwards, then the deceased is a member of the clergy. Interesting that they've got ways of showing that they're slightly different to the rest of us. But here we've got the hand pointing up, clutching roses and other flowers. Hand could point down, and here we've got uh, just that. Hand of God sometimes represents sudden death. This one I think is supposed to be the hand of God because you've got the clouds there in the background, and then the whole is surrounded by the snake eating its tail, and that very much is the circle of life. Weeping and a willow and a weeping willow, grief and earthly sorrow, um, and overtaken a little bit by lots of lichen. Dove, now symbol of purity and peace. Those appear quite often. You get actual carvings of doves in three dimensions. Here we've just got a, a carving of a dove just flat on a rather much larger gravestone. But we get these sorts of representations of doves again with flowers, roses, forget-me-nots, often passion flowers, uh, and all of these things will have particular meanings. Particularly when you get to the Victorian era, they were very keen to um, use flowers. We've already seen quite a few angels on a number of the older stones. This is an older stone, but showing an angel here with what appears to be a mother and two children. Presumably she's there on a deathbed. Um, little difficult perhaps to interpret, but it must mean something like that. And an angel with a trumpet. signifies the day of judgment. So when the trumpet calls, you need to be ready. This is Arnos Vale, and they're rightly proud of all of the angels that they've got there. This is a different sort of angel. This is a stone that would have been standing upright, which is now down on the ground horizontal and filled with water. So this is never what the sculptor had dreamt of, but I quite like this sort of bathing angel. Um, it actually, well, it looks pretty good in monochrome as well. And a yet more uncommon motif, arrow and quiver, weapons of death, also a symbol of plague. I'm not so sure about this being anything to do with plague, in that when the plague was rife in a lot of these communities, um, the dead had to be buried en masse and very, very quickly. Um, but I don't know. And then what I thought to begin with was sheer vandalism with a broken column and the ivy sort of holding the stonework together is nothing of the sort. That's the way that the stonemason had intended it in the first place. And when you go around some of these bigger cemeteries and you see this repeated a few times, you start to think that the Vandals can't all have been quite so precise. So it's a symbol for the end of a life, or more specifically, a life cut short. And perhaps the length of the column up to the capital there, that's how much might have been expected. So a lot of that's been about just ambling around churchyards, taking pictures of what's there in terms of stones. But isn't that just record shots of other people's art? That's what the stonemason did. So that's the art. Well, to my mind, I think time has changed a lot of these memorials. The lichen and the moss on the stone change it. They change the colours. Here and there, they degrade the surface of the stone, so it changes the shape. Bits of the stonework go missing. So a number of the memorials that we've looked at were never as the way that the mason had thought that they would be. Taking pictures, quite rightly, you need to be aware of the sensitivities of photography in such places. The older yards and the ones that have gone into some decline, of course, you're unlikely to meet anybody else there. But not standing on the top of other people's graves to try to get the right angle is important, I think. But for some of these graveyards, it's almost impossible to get square on shots of some of the stones because there's another row right in the way. And what's missing, I think, can be as impressive or even more impressive than what's there. We'll look at that in a second. So I've been trying to produce things that are memorable. Well, they're memorable to me, but it continues to be a work in progress because I enjoy going round graveyards and looking at gravestones. And so I'm going to finish with a few that I like for particular reasons. So this is a plot in Arnos Vale, and mother, the family thought a lot of, and the urn there contained flowers at some time in the past. But mother might have died 100 years ago, something like that. And the immediate family, the first generation, then have gone, and the next generation, and things fall into a little bit of decay. So Mother Nature perhaps is taking over here. It's getting a little overgrown. The artificial glass green stony sort of chippings are gradually being replaced by vegetation, and yeah, Mother Nature perhaps taking over. As I said, what's not there can be as impressive as what's there. Uh, a, a brass or a bronze piece of ornamentation on this rather nice, I think it's sort of a pink granite. Well, it's not there anymore, but the verdigris, the corrosion products, the coppery corrosion out of the metalwork has left its mark. That's not of any value to anyone, so no one's going to try and steal that. So you can see what had been there, but in a different colour, different texture to that had been thought of. And more so than that, here we've then got lichen and few mosses starting to encroach onto the wider part of the stone. Again, those sorts of corrosion products, but they're not immediately around where the cross stood. Um, they show a sort of bleeding, a sort of fading into the stonework. And then moving on in terms of metalwork, this was up in Kirkconnell churchyard there, and I'd been taking some pictures, and I looked around quickly and thought there are eyes looking at me. And on closer inspection, I thought there are two eyes looking at me. So you can have rather plain metal railings, or you can have some rather better ones. That's rather nice. And when you've got one, you can have two. And then the bracken tries to get in on the act as well, in terms of a similar sort of shape, slightly different point to it, but these are very much a study in terms of the texture and the shape. And these are sorts of things that appeal to me and my photography. The stonemason had done his bit and put a scroll on the end of this rather large and thick piece of stone, and now the ivy is adding its ornamentation to it, following that lip there up around the edge. So it's adding something that the stonemason never thought of in the first place. And now I'm going to finish with a picture that appeals to me, and I'll, I'll tell you why. So this is in Arnos Vale, and again I think this is a picture before a lot more of the trees had been cleared, and the stonemason in producing this gravestone, this is edge on, and I don't think he ever thought that we would have an eye up there, top left, a Roman nose, and an upturned mouth. But that's what I saw in it. And more than that, the colours and the texture, the stone with the greys of the tree trunk there in the background. So I find that quite an appealing picture. But you would say I'm strange like that. So thank you very much.